Hey everyone, I'm going to talk about a pretty popular but highly criticized language learning hypothesis, second or subsequent language learning hypothesis, by a famous linguist called Stephen Krashen. And well, I want to talk about this and many other language learning theories and hypotheses because this is a new field, right? Teaching English as a second language, learning languages, and understanding how people learn language is pretty new still. It really got going in the 60s. So I think it's helpful to know where we're at and what we understand so that as a learner, you can try to shift your focus and how you're learning, but also for me as a teacher in how I teach. So, and really, this hypothesis, this model, has helped me a lot in terms of understanding things, whether it's right or wrong. It really has helped me. Okay, so the first part of this, well, it's called the monitor model. Okay, and there's 5 parts to it. There's 5 hypotheses that are part of this model. And the first one is called the language acquisition hypothesis. And essentially, that just means, and get this, it's really interesting, is that there are different systems that are working when we are learning a new language. One is called the acquisition system. One is acquisition, meaning we acquire, we absorb language by interacting authentically and meaningfully, usually through speaking, but also through reading. Um, and we just take it in, right? Kids are especially really good at this, but adults also have access to the ability to just absorb and acquire a language just through reading and just through listening. It is a different process. It is not as easy as it is for kids. So that's one, that there's the acquisition side. And the other side of this hypothesis is that there is a learning side. Okay, learning in this hypothesis just means that you're studying rules, you're learning grammar, you're breaking down parts of a language and looking at syntax in order to learn it. Okay, so now the hypothesis for acquisition and learning is that these are 2 different systems. The acquisition part of learning a new language or acquiring a new language helps us to be more fluent. It helps to give us the ability to start talking. Whereas the learning part of the hypothesis gives us the ability to monitor and notice what we're saying and what we're writing and to fix it when we recognize inevitably errors and mistakes. Okay, so ideally you would have access to input, reading and speaking, that is acquisition, right? That you can acquire naturally, meaningfully. But then the other side is that you would be studying rules and you would be looking at grammar so that you can monitor your production or output of the language. Okay, so this linguist, Krashen, actually suggests and says that acquisition is more important than noticing because acquisition is what accounts for our fluency, essentially. There are a lot of people that criticize that and say, no, in fact, you can uh, acquire language by noticing as well. Okay, so that's the first part. So acquisition versus learning. The second hypothesis to this interesting model is that one that is called the monitor hypothesis. So I mentioned it earlier in the acquisition and learning hypothesis, and that is that when you are producing output, when you're writing and when you're speaking, both acquisition and learning are playing together in order to help you to produce something. So, what that means is you're using what you've acquired to help you produce something, especially when you're speaking. You try to be fluent, you try to produce language. And then this other process is happening in the back called monitoring and noticing, which is coming from your ability to have learned rules, okay? The grammar rules. And the more rules you know, the more you monitor and pay attention to what you're saying, and for the good and the bad, actually. They say that some people who have focused so much on learning grammar rules and that kind of thing and not acquiring get stuck and they don't produce, right? They're so focused on it being accurate and correct. So you want to have both at play. But again, the linguist Krashen says that it's really more important to have access to acquisition in terms of learning. But for writing skill, you do want to have the ability to access a monitor, and that monitor will ignite if you have learned the rules. Okay. All right, so really interesting. The third part of this monitor model is called the natural order hypothesis. So the natural order hypothesis is also really interesting because, well, anyway, it's called the natural order hypothesis, and it means that rules are learned in a natural order. We cannot, a grammar book cannot predict or tell us what we will learn. We will learn the rules in an order that is, some people say, predictable based off your first language, based off a lot of things. But there's a specific order in which we learn certain rules. And so, for example, grammar books will say, okay, learn the simple present first, then learn the simple past. Then eventually you get up to more complex forms like passive, present perfect, progressive, embedded questions. Well, even though those are more advanced according to a grammar book, you might actually learn those first before you learn how to use the simple present, for example, okay? So there is a natural order in which we learn. And so the idea is that, well, maybe we shouldn't be learning or teaching grammar in a specific order. It should happen in a more natural way based off of where the students are at, and also in terms of what we're reading and learning, okay? So that takes me to the fourth hypothesis of this model, which is the comprehensible input hypothesis, which I love. And I think this one has really helped drive a lot of designs of language learning programs. So the comprehensible input hypothesis is, we write it like this: C plus I. So C plus I, this just means comprehension level, where you're at. Are you a beginner? Are you intermediate? Are you advanced or between? And then I means it means, hold on, what does it mean? Hold on. Yeah. Okay. So comprehension, what level you're at, beginning, intermediate, advanced, or somewhere in between. And I is input. So input meaning what kind of information, language, the target language you're learning, do you hear and read, okay? Because when you're learning a language, you go through levels before you become, proficient and advanced. So your comprehension level, where you're at, plus the input. Now, what that means is it should be comprehension plus, that means one step above your comprehension level should the input come in, okay? So if I'm a beginner and I want to improve and get meaningful input from what I'm reading or learning, the person talking to me or the thing I'm reading should be not at my level, not 5 levels above, but one step above my level, because that is the ideal place to be in order to push me up to the next level. Why? Because I understand where I'm at, I understand things, and then I start to understand forms, words, and ideas at one step above. And when I have input that is comprehensible but one step above my level, it's meaningful, and I can acquire and absorb new forms, okay? So that's the comprehensible input hypothesis, okay? I, as a teacher, try to expose students to comprehensible input. It gets a little difficult when I have a class with students at different levels, as you can imagine. Okay, now, the last part of this monitor model is the affective filter hypothesis. So the affective filter is basically just saying that a person's affect, the way in which they, feel, okay, affects the amount of language that they're able to acquire, right, and take in, okay? So what that means is that for a teacher, for a language learning environment, I want to create an environment where my students feel comfortable. Not like so relaxed that they fall asleep, but not judged, not like I'm going to make them feel bad for getting something wrong and making a mistake or something. I want to make it a welcoming place where they feel comfortable. So here's how I learned how this works, okay? It's a fun chart to look at. So we have comprehensible input, right? Actually, okay. So this is how I put all of this monitor model together on a board, okay? So we have the person who is trying to learn the language. This is the learner, right? They're learning, okay? And they receive input. Ideally, they would receive comprehensible input. Remember, input, that's one step above their comprehension level. So they will receive that, right? And then ideally, they will produce output, okay? But the output they produce is going to be monitored by their knowledge of the rules, right? So the monitor is going to be checking their output and adjusting and learning from mistakes, actually, okay? Now, this ability for them to take in the language can be high or low depending on the affective filter. So imagine there's this invisible like wall or filter in front of them. So we want you to learn. We want you to take in this comprehensible input through reading and meaningful things, not just grammar, okay? But if the wall is there, if the filter is up high because you're nervous, then information's just going to come back, or only a little bit will come through. But if the affective filter is not so high and it's lowered by creating a comfortable environment in the classroom, a good relationship with your students, right? Then the filter goes down and more input can go into the learner's brain, right? So that it can be acquired and learned, okay? And then it goes through the monitor, boop, produce output, and ideally that's great. This information, again, should be comprehensible input according to the monitor model, not grammatically sequenced rules. However, because you're writing and because it does help to learn grammar, when you produce output, when you produce language, if you do know the rules, if you have studied the rules of a language, then you will be able to fix and make repairs. So what this means to me is that in my class, I need to provide students with authentic and meaningful readings and conversations So that, but I also need to provide them with language rules and forms according to the the readings and the listenings we do, so that it's meaningful. I don't want to just use a grammar book and, okay, today we're studying simple past. Okay, tomorrow we're studying, without it being connected to something that they're going to write about or read about or talk about. And that's really, really, really hard to do. But anyway, that is the Monitor motto. And I hope that it maybe has helped you as a learner to sort of look at the way that you're learning language and the way you feel about your classroom or the methods you're learning. And to notice, yeah, it's good to know the rules. It's also good to read. It's also good to listen to things you're interested in. All right. Thanks, everyone.